Japan is considered to have one of the highest levels of education in the world. The origin of this educational system was already in existence during the Edo period in the 1800s. Although there were many schools in existence even prior to that time, they were almost entirely for the privileged classes, such as the samurai. However, when the samurai began to lose their influence towards the end of the Edo period, the children of the common people came to be able to attend schools. Those schools were called terakoya, or temple schools. Monks, priests and physicians taught children at their own homes. The classes at these temple schools consisted of the study of reading, writing and the use of an abacus, so that the children could read books, write characters and learn the basics of arithmetic. These temple schools were located not only in large cities such as Kyoto and Edo, but throughout Japan.
The year 1868 witnessed the end of the world of the samurai, along with the beginning of the Meiji period. The Meiji government abolished the feudal system that had been in effect until that time and began to implement various new systems to take its place. Reforms were implemented throughout all aspects of society, including politics, economics, military affairs, education, and culture. Numerous students were sent overseas to advanced nations at the time, such as the US and European countries, in order to carry out the implementation of these reforms. These were voyages that took a long time and often through rough seas. These students then learned and brought back this advanced knowledge and technology to Japan. In addition, specialists and technicians in various fields were invited from overseas at a high rate of compensation to learn and absorb the advanced technology available at that time from them. As a result, industry achieved a rapid rate of growth, concentrating primarily on the steel industry and so on. Dramatic improvements were also made in agricultural technology. Through expansion of the amount of arable land and improvement of the varieties of crops planted, the production volume continued to grow. In 1872, the Meiji government began an attempt to modernize education. Elementary school education was made to be compulsory based on the educational system in France. This compulsory education was implemented equally for all people, regardless of status, class, or wealth. In the beginning of the 1900s, all villages, no matter how remote, had their own elementary school. The percentage of school attendance reached 98%, and the youth literacy rate stood at nearly 100%. The propelling force of this education resulted in even further growth in the industrial economy of Japan. The annual rate of economic growth at that time was 4%. The total population of Japan in the 1880s was roughly 36 million, and the natural rate of increase was nearly 0.8%. The distribution of age groups was in the form of a pyramid. When the economic growth rate of 4% is divided by the rate of population increase of 0.8%, this yields a demographic elasticity coefficient of 5. Although this coefficient was named by a Japanese demographer, a coefficient value of around 5 is considered to be the optimum state for economic takeoff. This is a comparison of the demographic elasticity coefficients of Japan at that time with 3 present Asian countries. In other words, no matter how much economic development progresses, if the rate of increase of the population is excessively large, that population increase ends up canceling out the effects of economic development. Conversely, if there is an inadequate population for supporting economic development, substantial economic development cannot be anticipated. In Japan of the 1880s, both of these factors were ideally in balance. In 1945, Japan lost nearly everything it had accomplished since the Meiji period as a result of the Second World War. Numerous industrial cities were destroyed, and the majority of production equipment was unable to be used. As a result, rebuilding and restoration were the primary tasks at hand, and the people of Japan put forth all of their effort towards accomplishment of those tasks. This indicates the changes in economic development in Japan following the end of the Second World War. The economy of Japan entered a high economic development period starting around the 1960s. This was followed by a low economic development period due to the oil shock and depreciation of the value of the yen in the first part of the 1970s. However, starting in the latter half of the 1980s, economic development once again began to turn upwards. In other words, the period of 10 years, starting in 1945, was a time of increased production of food, along with rebuilding and restoration of production equipment. The period from 1960 to 1975 witnessed astonishing economic development unlike that seen previously anywhere else in the world, concentrating primarily on the heavy and chemical industries. It was a time of prosperity, resulting from large volume production and large volume consumption. However, this tremendous economic development resulted in contamination of the air, rivers, and ocean, causing people to suffer from the effects of pollution. After entering a period of low economic development starting in 1975, technical renovations were implemented in high-tech industries and the information industry, resulting in a changeover from the previous industrial structure, which concentrated on heavy and chemical industries. The progress made in these fields led to automated, multi-product, low-volume production, taking full advantage of robots. Various phenomena occurred accompanying the course of this economic development, including the concentration of the population in cities and the depopulation of rural communities. This indicates the changes that occurred in the rate of population increase in Japan following the Second World War. With the exception of a short period of time immediately after the end of the war, the population demonstrated a continuous increase. The total population around 1945 was approximately 72 million. Although the natural rate of increase averaged 1% per year until 1975, after which it began to decrease, the total population as of 1990 currently stands at roughly 123 million. With respect to the distribution of age groups, although the proportion of young males had been reduced considerably in 1945 due to the Second World War, the age distribution returned to its typical pyramid form in 1955. Both the birth rate and the death rate then began to decrease, so that the age group distribution gradually began to take on the form of a barrel. In looking at the changes in the population, roughly 82% of the population lived in rural communities in the year 1920, when the first national census was conducted in Japan. Later, with the exception of the period during the Second World War, the percentage of the population living in rural communities continued to decrease until it reached a level of roughly only 23% in 1990. In other words, this means that 77% of the population of Japan currently resides in cities. More specifically, nearly 1/4 of the total population is concentrated in the Tokyo metropolitan area. Reflecting these circumstances, escalating land prices, housing difficulties, and refuse disposal have become major social problems in large cities. In rural communities, on the other hand, since nearly all of the workers have moved to the cities, progressing depopulation has resulted in a situation in which the elderly are the only ones left there. However, during the low economic development period in the latter half of the 1970s, the economies of large metropolitan areas began to suffer a depression, while the level of economic development in regional cities increased to a relatively high level. This led to the beginning of giant U-turns and J-turns to regional cities from large metropolitan areas, giving rise to a counterflow phenomenon in the population. Although this trend continued until the latter half of the 1980s, the counterflow phenomenon finally came to a halt in 1987 due to the favorable upturn of industries related to internal demand. As a result, the population once again continued its one-sided concentration in Tokyo. The previous description has attempted to provide a general overview of the trends in the economy and population of Japan. During the period of roughly 100 years, starting with the economic takeoff that began in the 1880s, the national income increased by roughly 40 times. However, the population only increased by roughly 3 times during that time. As such, the power of education was an extremely important factor in creating the prosperity that is enjoyed today.
Although Japan lost many things during the war, there was one treasure that was left. That treasure is education. Education that had been carefully cultivated since the Meiji period also demonstrated its considerable influence in the restoration and rebuilding that took place following the war. Amidst the poverty and famine that was present throughout the country immediately after the war, Japan extended its compulsory education beyond that of elementary school to also include 3 years of junior high school, bringing to 9 years the total number of years of compulsory education. Although the investment made in education by the country was considerable, each family was also extremely enthusiastic towards education. Parents would frequently go without food so that they could feed their children, buy them textbooks, and allow them to attend school. This indicates the ratios of students advancing to high schools, colleges, and junior colleges, starting in 1955. The ratio of students advancing to high school currently stands at better than 90%, having essentially reached a level equivalent to that of compulsory education. The rapid growth of Japan during the 1960s was achieved by people who had acquired a broad range of specialized knowledge and advanced skills through higher education, both before and after the war. The social environment in Japan also underwent a considerable change following the defeat in the Second World War. the Constitution, along with various legal systems, were successively reformed to those which were more democratic, resulting in concepts such as equal rights for men and women, freedom, equality, and human rights spreading throughout society. Women in particular, who had formerly been bound by the rigid restrictions of the feudal family system, realized higher social status as a result of the new civil code. Women began to be employed in various types of work in hopes of entering the workforce. Changes also took place in the sense of values and consciousness of the people as a result of the higher level of education. Relationships between parents and children, as well as between husband and wife, and views concerning labor and marriage became increasingly diversified. The progression of the nuclear family was one result of this. Concepts of health and hygiene, as well as family planning and so on, proliferated in an extremely natural and smooth fashion. This, too, can be said to be one of the benefits of education. This indicates the transitions in the current contraceptive implementation rate and infant mortality rate. The steady proliferation of family planning can be witnessed in this figure as evidenced by the solid implantation of the concept of bearing fewer children to raise them healthy, or in other words, fewer births and fewer deaths. However, as of 1990, the birth rate and total fertility rate, which refer to the number of children born by one woman during her lifetime, has decreased to only 1.53 children, a fact which has had a major shock on the Japanese people. On the other hand, this decrease in the birth rate has invited a rapid rise in the proportion of elderly citizens in the population. In rural communities, the decreased birth rate is bringing about a decrease in the future population. If the population continues to maintain its present course, there will be a shortage of young labourers to support the industry of tomorrow, which is feared to have major repercussions in a wide range of fields. Even at present, there is already a serious shortage of workers in numerous industries, which has led to heated discussions over the pros and cons of employing foreign workers. Fewer births and fewer deaths were certainly one of the ways to control increases in the population. However, problems relating to population have the perplexing characteristic in which, as soon as one problem is solved, a new problem arises to take its place. As such, Japan is presently being faced with new topics and new types of problems relating to population.
The concentration of the population and industry in areas surrounding major metropolitan areas has caused various problems, such as environmental problems, as well as differences between specific regions and differences in income. In an effort to counteract this growing trend, the National Land Development Plan was implemented in 1962 for the purpose of balanced land development throughout the country. The new Industrial City Construction Promotion Act was enacted based on this plan, in an effort to industrialize regions in which development was lagging behind. As a result, 15 regions were specifically designated for such development in order to eliminate regional differences. A representative region where this act was implemented is the Mizushima Industrial Park, located in Kurashiki City, Okayama Prefecture. A port was established and an industrial housing development was created at this site, followed by the construction of numerous factories, including petrochemical complexes, ironworks, electrical power plants, and food processing plants. Simultaneous to the construction of these new industrial cities, 6 special industrial facility regions were designated in a zone stretching along the Pacific coast, such as the Kashima district in Ibaraki Prefecture. At this Kashima district in Ibaraki Prefecture, which was designated as one of these regions, a new port was constructed and preparations for an industrial park were made on a huge scale. However, as the country at that time was right in the middle of a period of rapid economic growth, suppression of population flow into large cities, as well as correction of differences in income, were not carried out as had been planned. As a result, a new National Land Development Plan was created in 1969. The purpose of this plan was to foster and promote industries such as agriculture and forestry, marine resources, and tourism in regions throughout the country. This was followed by implementation of the 3rd and 4th National Land Development Plans in order to achieve decentralization of the population to rural communities in the future. As a result, continued progress was made towards the development of industries that are in harmony with the natural environment. Although this development is currently in progress, there have been strong requests from various municipalities for decentralization of authority from the centralized government to local governing bodies, transfer of authority, and decentralization of central government agencies to regional locations. It was at that point that the regional decentralization of government, administrative agencies, and educational institutions began. Regional administrative agencies then proceeded with the implementation of various policies and plans to promote regional activation. The One Village, One Product movement, begun in Oita Prefecture, is one example of these. That movement was introduced to not only Japan, but to numerous locations around the world. As a result of having been started as a movement to raise the level of independence of regional economies, observation groups came to visit Oita from various countries, including the UK, France, Germany, and China. The number of cities placing increasing efforts in cultural activities, such as original concerts, festivals, and the construction of art galleries, is increasing. In addition, there are also many regions proceeding with resort development. As in the case of Tachibana-cho in Yamaguchi Prefecture, sky sports facilities, such as those for hang gliding and parachute gliding, have been constructed in order to expand the range of interchange between cities and rural communities in an effort to promote regional activation. Efforts such as these, which promote regional development and activation, are spreading throughout the country based on the concept of city restoration and community restoration. Accompanying the substantiation of nationwide expressway transportation networks and telecommunications networks, there has been an increasing tendency towards decentralization of corporations to regional locations. The use of optical communication networks, facsimiles, and communication satellites has greatly shortened the distance between large metropolitan areas and regional cities, allowing each to fulfill its respective functions. As this type of regional development progressed, concentration of the population in the cities of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka virtually came to a standstill, with the rates of population growth decreasing in those cities. What's more, the populations of regional cities began to increase. After 20 years since the current era was first referred to as the regional age, Efforts toward multipolarization and decentralization are gradually beginning to demonstrate their effects. Despite the various efforts that have been made, the income difference between large metropolitan areas and regional areas is again beginning to widen following a short period of reduction in the 1980s. Even within Japan, the problem of the so-called regional differences has still not been solved.
The world population is continuing to increase at an explosive rate. The world population stood at 5.4 billion in the first half of 1990, and we are warned that it will reach 6.4 billion in the year 2001, and finally exceed the 10 billion mark in the year 2050. It is estimated that 95% of this increase will occur in developing countries. Moreover, as the populations of such countries are already concentrated in their respective major cities, further increases in the population will give rise to the creation of slums. Japan has experienced various population problems over the course of the past 100 or so years. It has managed to solve these problems by mutual cooperation at both the national and private levels. The solving of those problems was mainly the result of the continuing investments made in education by Japan, along with the wisdom and knowledge that resulted from that education. Japan is still faced with various population problems, including a decreasing birth rate, a rapidly rising proportion of elderly in society, overpopulation, and depopulation. However, various countermeasures have already been implemented to solve those problems as a result of bringing together the wisdom and knowledge that have been cultivated so far. As one of the countries that comprise Asia, it is necessary for Japan to work together with those developing countries in Asia that are facing various population problems in an effort to learn from each other and cooperate to solve those problems. It is through such efforts that the final result will be the creation of a peaceful and prosperous Asia.